Welcome. Let's get started on today's press call to discuss the current anti-transgender rule proposed by HUD. Again, my name is Lisa Marlowe. I'm the Manager of Communications and Media Relations at the Coalition. And today I'm joined by some very special people who are here to continue to push back on this very cruel rule. Today's call is scheduled to end at approximately 11:45 a.m. Eastern Time. We will have time at the end of today's call for a question and answer period. On today's agenda, we're going to hear some remarks by Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton. We're also going to hear some information about ways that the media could cover this cruel rule from Gillian Branstetter. We're going to hear about the Housing Saves Lives campaign from Diane Waguespack. And we're going to hear about some policy solutions from NLIHC President and CEO Diane Yentel. And again, we'll close out with a question and answer period. At that time, I'm happy to unmute your mics if you raise your hands, and you can ask your questions live, or feel free to submit your questions via the chat box. So with that, I'll turn it over to Diane Yentel to introduce Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton. Diane?
Great, thanks, Lisa, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this important press call. I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton. Representative Wexton has been serving the people of Northern Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley for nearly 2 decades as a prosecutor, an advocate for abused children, a state senator, and now a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. She's been a champion for the LGBTQ community in Congress and has fought back against HUD's discriminatory anti-transgender rule since it was first proposed in 2019. Representative Wexton has introduced legislation to block this policy, and after the rule was published last month, she led 144 of her her colleagues in the House and the Senate in a public comment letter opposing the rule. So I want to thank Congresswoman Wexton for her leadership on this important issue and for joining us and for continuing to fight against this cruel proposed rule. Welcome, Congresswoman Wexton. I'll turn it to you for remarks.
Thank you so much, Diane. And first, I want to thank the National Low Income Housing Coalition for hosting today's call and for all the important advocacy of all my fellow panelists to push back against this discriminatory rule. We are here to highlight the need for the public to speak out against a dangerous anti-trans policy that would give federally funded shelters a license to discriminate against transgender people. As was mentioned in Diane's bio, I've been fighting back against this rule in Congress for more than a year now. Back in May of 2019, during a House Financial Services Committee hearing, I pressed Secretary Ben Carson on whether his department had plans to make changes to the Equal Access Rule, which he denied. But the very next day, HUD first announced their intention to gut these protections for trans Americans. Now, after Secretary Carson's false testimony, I introduced the Ensuring Equal Access to Shelter Act to block HUD's efforts to gut the Equal Access Rule. And my colleagues and I have also been working to stop the implementation of this rule through the appropriations process. Last month, I led more than 120 of my House colleagues and 23 senators in a public comment letter in fierce opposition to HUD's rule and requesting that the Secretary rescind it immediately. An overwhelming rejection of this discriminatory policy through the public comment period is now one of our best chances to fight this rulemaking. Because HUD has made it clear that they will not respect the recent Supreme Court ruling in Bostock versus Clayton County, which affirmed federal protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And this is despite a letter I sent recently with House Financial Services Committee Chairwoman Maxine Waters requesting that HUD reconsider publication of their rule in light of this decision. HUD has also perpetuated the dangerous myth that protecting transgender people's access to shelter and accommodations that reflect their gender identity puts others at risk. There is no evidence to support this assertion, and HUD itself, in their proposed rulemaking, admit it. From the rule, I would like to quote some language from their proposed rule. While HUD is not aware of data suggesting that transgender individuals pose an inherent risk to biological women, there is anecdotal evidence that some women may fear that non-transgender biological men may exploit the process of self-identification under the current rule in order to gain access to women's shelters. Now, as was indicated, that has no basis in fact, no data to back it up. And additionally, more than 300 sexual assault and domestic violence organizations who are on the front lines serving those experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity have spoken out to reject this argument. So for over a year now, Secretary Carson has not provided any credible justification for this rule change. It is clear that his policy is nothing more than an attack on transgender Americans. So to every American who's outraged by this dangerous and discriminatory policy as I am, I encourage you to submit a public comment before the deadline on September 22nd. And you can do so by going to housingsaveslives.org, which you will hear more about on this call. Shelters save lives, and if this rule goes into effect, transgender individuals are at risk of having nowhere to turn when they need emergency shelter. So we need to fight against this rule like trans lives depend on it, because they do. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Representative Wexton. We appreciate your tireless efforts and we appreciate your support. I'm going to turn it over now to Gillian Branstetter from the National Women's Law Center. Gillian?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Representative Wexton and the rest of the coalition for leading this critical fight. Few experiences are more commonly shared among transgender people than a lack of stable housing. And this crisis worsens our chances of harassment, abuse, and violence. This was unfortunately the case for Alexa Negron-Luciano, a transgender woman who was fatally shot in Toa Bora, Puerto Rico, after social media posts shamed and humiliated her in January of this year. This was the case for Marilyn Cazares of Brawley, California, who was found dead in an abandoned house just last month after suffering stab and burn wounds. This was the case for Tete Goli, found hanging from a tree in Portland, Oregon last summer. This was the case for both Ashante Carmen and Zoe Spears, both homeless and both murdered just several miles from our nation's capital last year. The stakes of this matter could not possibly be higher. All of these women were women of color, and all but one was a Black woman. They were daughters, sisters, mentors, and each deserves a far more meaningful commemoration than a headline, a hashtag, and a press release. If we want to prevent abuse, we must empower the abused before they become a trending topic, not after. Instead, the Trump administration seeks to erode the supports transgender people need to ensure our own safety, and reliable access to safe, stable housing is among the most crucial. Since it was enacted in 2012, the Equal Access Rule has made clear nobody should feel comfortable taking taxpayer dollars in one hand and turning a transgender person back to the street with the other. Rolling this protection back would have a devastating impact on the ability of any trans person to keep themselves safe. As new data from the National Alliance to End Homelessness reveals, disability, chronic illness, HIV, and self-harm are all more common among trans people who are unsheltered versus those who have access to reliable emergency housing. Unsheltered trans people are also more likely to interact with emergency services and law enforcement, including 10 times more likely to be funneled into a prison system that is indifferent at best to the sexual trauma trans people face within its walls. Secretary Carson apparently shares that indifference. He wishes to distract from these very real harms of rape and violence by focusing on invented fears and absurd hypotheticals, as if abusers needed to resort to costumes and gimmickry to attack women. Instead of conjuring fairy tales to please a political base, an active HUD department should be directly engaged with the most vulnerable among us and ensure they have safe, equitable access to these and all programs provided by our government. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. I really appreciate that speech. Thank you so much. I'm now going to turn it over to Dylan Waguespack from True Colors United. Dylan?
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you to Diane, Congresswoman Wexton, and Gillian for your remarks and for the actions that you're taking to stop this harmful rule. My name is Dylan Waguespack, and I'm the Public Policy and External Affairs Director for True Colors United, a nonprofit founded by Cindy Lauper to end LGBTQ youth homelessness, and a co-chair of the Housing Saves Lives campaign. The Housing Saves Lives campaign was founded earlier this year in opposition to this anti-trans shelter rule and is made up of a number of national, state, and local organizations across the US, who are deeply concerned by this administration's efforts to deny safe access to shelter to transgender people at their most vulnerable time. Our partners include the National Center for Transgender Equality, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, the National LGBTQ Task Force, the National Women's Law Center, at the ACLU, and more. The full list can be found on our website at housingsaveslives.org. I want to reiterate that this proposed rule will have incredibly dangerous consequences for transgender people experiencing homelessness. Should the rule go into effect, trans people will avoid seeking out services out of fear of violence or discrimination. Shelters are, in most communities, the best access point to the safe and individual housing options that the CDC has stressed must be made available to individuals experiencing homelessness during the pandemic, meaning that this rule could very well put an entire class of people already facing severe health disparities, like the ones Gillian referenced in her remarks, at increased risk of falling ill with COVID-19. It's deeply alarming that HUD would be spending their time right now looking for new ways to allow discrimination against transgender people at a time when their grantees are on the front lines of this pandemic, working to prevent community spread and to preserve the health of people experiencing homelessness. To that end, the Housing Saves Lives campaign is working to mobilize people across the US to participate in the regulatory process by submitting a public comment in opposition to the rule. This week, the campaign is hosting a National Week of Action to engage people in faith communities, in mayor's offices, across the community development and housing field, and everyday people who believe that Secretary Carson's proposal puts him on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of the law. We want to invite anyone who believes that discrimination is just plain wrong to join our campaign and share with their friends, family, and neighbors the tools at housingsaveslives.org, which the campaign has put together to make it easy for people to submit a public comment and lead conversations in their communities about the dangers of this rule. And thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Dylan, appreciate it. I'm going to turn now over to Diane Yentel with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Diane?
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you, Dylan, Gillian, and Representative Wexton for your remarks. On behalf of everyone at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, I want to echo what has been said and just state clearly that Secretary Carson's anti-trans proposal is abhorrent and unconscionable. The equal access rules protections against discrimination are critical to ensure safe access to shelter for transgender people experiencing homelessness. Protecting transgender people's access to gender-specific facilities does not endanger the safety or privacy of others. Discrimination is never okay, but this proposal is particularly heinous as our nation continues to struggle to control the coronavirus pandemic. Transgender people, especially trans women and trans people of color, are at extraordinarily high risk of violence. For this community specifically, access to a shelter is a critical form of physical safety against such threat of violence and harassment. This administration's proposed rule would limit and place restrictions on transgender people's ability to access shelter. A proposal like this is particularly cruel at a time when tens of millions of renters across the United States may lose their homes in the coming months, while the White House and HUD has done next to nothing to assist them. Access to shelter during and after COVID-19 is a public health necessity. For trans people experiencing homelessness, it is a matter of life or death. The National Low Income Housing Coalition rejects HUD's perpetuation of negative and harmful stereotypes of transgender people, as well as the administration's continued attack on members of the LGBTQ community. NLIHC has been fighting against discriminatory rhetoric, policies, and rule changes from the beginning of this administration, and we will continue to fight them to oppose this cruel rule. A lot is happening in the United States right now. A historic public health threat in the form of COVID-19, a national reckoning with racial injustices against the Black community, natural disasters that are disproportionately affecting marginalized communities, and families fearing that they may not have a home next week or next month. These are unprecedented times, and we are dealing with an unprecedented administration that sees a window of opportunity to inflict further harm rather than heal our communities. This cannot be ignored. The Housing Saves Lives campaign and this week of action will provide multiple tools to advocates to demand that HUD rescind this cruel rule, including guidance on how to submit a public comment. Engaging in collective action is critical to ensure that the transgender community can have access to basic human necessities. We urge everyone, individuals, organizations, public officials, business leaders, religious leaders, all concerned citizens, to join us in submitting their comments opposing this rule. Lisa, I'll turn back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. Now I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Again, I invite everyone to either submit their questions in the chat box, or you could raise your hand and I can call on you and unmute your mic, and you could ask your question live. So I'm going to give it a minute for people to put their questions in chat box or raise their hand. We do have one question that came in, and I'm going to open this up to the floor, including Representative Wexton if she wants to chime in. The question is, the administration is retaining gender identity as a protected class in this rule. What is the impact of that, and do trans people still have some protections from discrimination? Again, I open it up to the floor. Anyone, please feel free to chime in.
That's a really great question. I'll take a first crack at it, but if somebody else wants to jump in, feel free. In essence, this administration believes, and we've seen this not just in HUD, but across other departments, that they can retain protections on the basis of gender identity while allowing discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So it's really it's absolutely mind-boggling, because you read this rule and you see that it says that someone can't be turned away just because they're trans, but in reality the structure that they're creating is one where categorically a shelter could refuse service to all trans women or to all trans men. And a shelter that serves people of multiple genders could say, well, we will allow trans people through the door, but we will force them to access services in alignment with their sex assigned at birth, which is what discrimination against transgender people looks like. So it's absolutely, not a good faith argument to make that this administration is preserving those protections, because the truth is that under the structure of how this rule works, they're completely eliminated.
Thank you, Dylan. Does anyone else want to chime in response to that question?
Hi, it's Jennifer Wexton. I would just say that the administration can't have it both ways in this instance. You can't say on the one hand that transgender identity is a protected class. Oh, but by the way, you can discriminate against them with a wink and a nod. It's also important to keep in mind that there's no data to show that housing, for example, transgender women with biological women poses any threat or danger to either of those groups. But we do know the data does back up that misassigning or classifying transgender women and making them be housed according to their sex assigned at birth does have real dangerous implications for that class of people. So, it's a completely farcical justification on the part of the administration, and they're putting trans lives at risk by allowing this discrimination.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Let me see if we have any other questions. I have another question. That question is, what forms of citizen advocacy and activism have you found to be the most effective with this administration, especially transgender discrimination protections? Does anyone want to chime in with that response?
Well, it's Jennifer Wexton. I'll just chime in that anytime we can get citizen input, it's a good thing. And that's one of the things that we're pushing for with the public comment now. because at least as far as the public comment is concerned, every single public comment has to be read and responded to by the administration. And it will certainly be used, and I can defer to Gillian on this, but it will certainly be something that is relied upon and looked at and used in any pending lawsuits that arise out of the attempts to rescind this rule. Because, you know, if they don't have data to back up their side of the equation and we do on ours, then that goes a long way to show that their decision to amend and change this rule in this way is arbitrary and capricious. So, you know, I would hope that the public comment would change the hearts and minds of the administration. I'm not super optimistic that it will, but at this point, it is our best bet because, you know, because we know that this is extremely dangerous for transgender individuals seeking access to emergency housing. And we know that there's going to be a significant increase in the need for this housing in the near future. So I think that public outcry is the best way to attack this problem at this time.
Thank you, Representative Wexton. I would just add to that for an example of how the public comment campaign can add to the legal fight against such rules, you could look to the Eastern District of New York, where just a few weeks ago, a federal judge placed an injunction on enforcement of a different anti-trans rule out of the Department of Health and Human Services regarding non-discrimination protections within the Affordable Care Act. And within that ruling, it declares it arbitrary and capricious and does in fact cite that many of the concerns and many of the comments, even the ones that HHS chose to lift up themselves, were not responded to in full. So in this instance, we absolutely do want people to share their thoughts on this rule, which they can do at housingsaveslives.org. And we, likewise, the other value to this, and I would particularly encourage reporters to this, is to understand the true impact here, even looking through the comments that we've already received, which is showing here 4,000. There are a lot of service providers. There are a lot of people who are executive directors of shelters and housing programs and emergency, crisis center programs across the country, who are standing up and saying that in this instance, HUD is not speaking for them. Secretary Carson, by evincing a on its face discriminatory rule, is contradicting their very mission. So I think the public comments serve both purposes, one, in the legal fight, and then two, providing a context, which I think should be super important for reporters, in making sure that your readers understand that this rule is opposed by the people on the ground very broadly.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's an important point. Looking to see if we have any other questions. Here, this next one comes in that says, what message do you have to center marginalized voices, especially people of color, when discussing this topic? Gillian, do you want to chime in on that, about messaging for people of color?
Yeah, certainly. So I think a big thing that reporters can do, but also advocates themselves, is recognize that a lot of this work in this field is being done by local organizations and by harm reduction organizations. I'm thinking right here in DC of three very active organizations in Casa Ruby and HIPS and No Justice, No Pride. And really in cities and communities across the country, there are organizations doing that work. I think sometimes it's very easy to nationalize the conversation about transgender rights and expand it only to the national political sphere, and certainly on a national policy that might make sense. But I do think it's important for people to understand that this is having impact in their own backyard, and that's where you're going to find marginalized voices that should be raised up on this issue. While the work we're doing as national advocacy organizations is critically important, it's really the folks on the ground whose voices readers need to hear the most. And another reason that I point people to the value of public comments. Yeah.
And I would jump in and add a thought, and Gillian kind of addressed this in her earlier remarks, but there's an epidemic of anti-trans violence facing transgender women of color across this country, and especially Black transgender women. Housing is anti-violence work, right? There's something to be said for 4 walls and a door with a lock on it between someone and a person that intends to harm them, right? And without the protection of safe housing, people are left more vulnerable to that kind of violence that communities are experiencing right now, that is largely impacting Black transgender women. Homelessness is a racial justice issue as well, right? The history of our housing policies and the history of homelessness in the United States is one that is deeply built around racial segregation and racial discrimination against Black Americans. And so we see significantly higher rates of homelessness among Black people. And so it's a question of who's impacted by this. And when we look inside of the trans community specifically, Black trans people are experiencing homelessness more often and also are experiencing significantly more severe consequences when they are experiencing homelessness. And so it really is, I think, critical to be raising that, because this is, when we talk about this rule being dangerous, that's not rhetorical or hyperbolic. People are actually dying, and the ability to access safe shelter, which is again an access point for safe housing, is a critical bridge from where we are right now to a future where trans people are safe.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you. I did have another question that's kind of twofold. The question is, how can this collective action continue to amplify Representative Wexton's own efforts on the Hill? Additionally, how can reporters specifically continue to cover and elevate this issue? And I would really appreciate Representative Wexton if you could chime in first, just to make sure that reporters know how they can continue to cover your efforts on the Hill. How can other organizations as well help in making sure that your efforts on the Hill are amplified?
Absolutely. Shining a light on this issue is so important, especially because this is a marginalized community who do not always have voices out in the public speaking up for them. But this is something that is going to become a really acute issue as we face that wave of evictions that's coming up. We know that homelessness among the transgender and non-binary community is higher than it is in the population writ large. And this rule is completely without basis in fact or data. And it's completely discriminatory and absolutely, the timing of it is cruel and unnecessary. So I think that continuing the attention on it is extremely important, and continuing the public pressure is also something that will hopefully help get the administration to rethink its position on this discriminatory rule.
Thank you. Dylan, Gillian, do you guys have anything that you wanted to add to that, just from your respective organizations, how we can continue to amplify these efforts?
Yeah, I would just say that Congresswoman Wexton's work here is critically important to, coming to a final resolution on this issue. With the Bostock decision on Title VII, we are leaps and bounds closer to a collective understanding that transgender people are, under the letter of the law, protected from this kind of discrimination. However, some people really need it spelled out, right? So to have Congress, get behind a legislative solution to this that really, spells out that transgender people absolutely are protected, and very specifically, we are looking at federal interventions to the issues that trans people are facing. I think we can't understate the importance of that. So I hope that we will continue to have momentum building behind Congresswoman Wexton's efforts here, and that folks can get behind that and start to really move us forward.
Thanks, Dylan. I'm looking to see if we have any additional questions that came in the last 15 minutes. Okay. Seeing none, I just wanted to invite the panel to provide any additional last thoughts, any additional last takeaways that you want to share.
There's one last thing that I wanted to bring up, which is that from the perspective of the National Women's Law Center, and certainly in line with, as Representative Wexton raised, over 300 national organizations that work to end sexual and domestic violence against women, it's particularly offensive to see the administration advance a mythical belief that transgender rights and safety from sexual violence are at all at odds. And in so doing, they are in fact advancing a very archaic understanding of how violence is perpetrated and how it's perpetuated. And this is particularly true when you look into the specifics of the rule and how it basically provides a guidebook for identifying a trans woman, basically asking people who are working on the ground to analyze people for their height, their presence of an Adam's apple, their relative amount of body hair, and using very limited notions of what a woman looks like in order to limit the rights of trans women. All in pursuit of violence that the department readily admits is hypothetical. And within that same notion, it acknowledges that in fact, a lot of women within these programs do face violence from other women. And it speaks of that as if it's the weather. It speaks of that as if it's completely unchangeable. And instead of advancing policies that keep all women safe, it is chasing a factually baseless idea. And I think that's a critically important point, that this is something that I feel like can often devolve into sort of water cooler talking points. But on the ground, people understand that this is not going to keep anybody safe rolling back this rule. And in fact, will further endanger people who already face grave, grave risk for harm.
It's Jennifer Wexton. I want to associate myself with Gillian's remarks, which were so well put and so well said, and really kind of bring into sharp focus why this rule is so discriminatory and dangerous and hurtful and hateful, and why it's so important that we fight back against it. So I want to thank NLIHC for your efforts in calling us together, and for everybody on this panel for all the work that you've done to fight back against this and so many other discriminatory policies coming out of HUD and out of the Trump administration. And I do feel that the more that we bring public attention into this issue, and the more that we fight back against this fear and this baseless hypotheticals with actual facts and what we're hearing from providers on the ground, the better place that we'll be. So I want to just thank everybody on the call for all their work in this area, and I feel a great sense of optimism, but new resolve to do everything we can to stop this discriminatory rule.
Thank you, Representative Wexton. And thank you as well, Gillian and Dylan. Thank you all for your time, for your powerful words. With that, I want to conclude today's call, but you should, if you do have access to the slides, you should see now email addresses for the panel. Please feel free to get in contact with any one of us. But most importantly, please continue to share the messages that you heard on today's call. Please continue to visit the housingsavesliveslive.org site, submit the personal comments, and share with your network the importance of submitting their personal comments to push back and fight back against this cruel, cruel, cruel rule. So with that, again, thank you, panel. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's call. And I will say have a good rest of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa.